Welcome to the 5 Books for Catholics podcast, where experts explain their pick of 5 outstanding books on an aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. In this episode, Dwight Lindley will take us through his pick of the 5 best books by or on Jane Austen. Jane Austen is one of the finest and best-loved novelists in the English language. Catholics can learn a lot from her finely crafted character studies of Regency-era gentry. They are penetrating studies of the subtleties of commonplace virtue and vice. They are also informed by Austen's Christian faith. Dwight Lindley is the Barbara Longway Briggs Chair in English Literature at Hillsdale College. He has published essays and articles on Jane Austen, George Eliot, John Henry Newman, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Virginia Woolf, and others. He lives in southern Michigan with his wife Emily and their 9 children. Professor Lindley, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
First of all, could you tell us a little bit about what got you interested in your own area of specialization and how you came to publish and research on Jane Austen?
Certainly. I got into literature proper because I wanted to study. Well, I've always loved stories, but I also wanted a discipline where I could talk about everything. This is one of the things that initially attracted me to novels and poetry. I could talk about philosophy, psychology, theology, history, all of the different, everything that comes into human life is there. As to this period and Jane Austen in particular, I mean, I think I have what Americans call a certain Anglophilia. I've just always liked British literature and especially 19th century literature, big novels, and so I had that interest already in college, and then in graduate school I began studying. I think it's Jane Austen in particular, I was drawn to from high school on. I had read some of her novels, Pride and Prejudice and Emma, I remember. And then read her some more in college. And then it was not really until I was in graduate school that I began to really think more deeply about her. But why was I drawn to her? I think it's in part her strange combination of clarity and simplicity with depth. This is something that's unusual, I think, and special in her. It's like clear, deep water. Her stories, her language. I also think that I was drawn to her because she has this sparkling intelligence that is hard to describe. And my experience of reading her and reading what other people have written about her is that she is smarter than the people who write about her. She has an insight and a wit and a wisdom that really can't be caught easily, and yet it's present everywhere in her writing. So I'm really, really impressed with her, and have always enjoyed that intelligence of hers. And then finally, I would just say I was really drawn to her wisdom about everyday practical life and what I would call the drama of understanding and self-knowledge that she presents. This is something that I think I enjoyed in her from the start. There are all these dramas about love, famously, but they're always about the way that people in love misunderstand others and also misunderstand themselves, and the way that they gradually emerge out of that into the truth. And I think that's something that everyone enjoys in Jane Austen, but it's very hard to speak about as intelligently as she does. I really think I began to appreciate that more explicitly and concretely after I read more philosophy, because I think she's actually a very philosophically rich novelist, but I didn't really start to see that until I had gotten more experience myself. And I would say particularly John Henry Newman and Alistair MacIntyre helped me to understand some of what was going on in Jane Austen. So I can bring some of that up later as we're going through specific books.
And obviously, we think of, you mentioned MacIntyre, and sometimes we think of Jane Austen as a moralist. In fact, MacIntyre mentions her in that vein in, I believe it's chapter 8 or 9 of his book After Virtue.
Mm-hmm.
But Austen grew up in the faith. Her father was an Anglican priest. 2 of her brothers were ordained. She was a practicing Christian. She wrote prayers, and in the half hour before she died, what were perhaps her last recorded words, she said, "God grant me patience, pray for me, or pray for me." However, she did not wear her faith on her sleeve. So while it's easy to see her writing about the virtues much as Aristotle does, is Christianity prominent in her novels, or is it secondary?
It's a good question, and it's something that people have spilled a lot of ink on, because there's a sort of palpable Christian framework, moral framework, and then that I think undergirds her novels and her imagination. And then there are obviously some Christian social details, and there are all these clergymen and so forth, but they're not what we have come to think of as Christian dramas in a straightforward sense. So what to make of that? I think one of the things I would say is that, well, let me put it in 2 different ways. One, she comes from a time before Christianity had really been challenged in her culture. In the later night, she lived from the late 18th century to the early 19th century, a very short life, and she died in 1817. What happened over the rest of that century, the 19th century, is that the German higher criticism of the Bible and of the formulation of early Christianity, early Christian faith, and dogma and formation of creeds and all of these kinds of things, but especially the Bible. It was destabilized by German philologists and archaeologists and comparative anthropologists. There was just this development of all this kind of criticism of organized religion and its texts, which really destabilized the faith of many intellectuals throughout the rest of the century. And so when you read later novels from the 19th century, such as those by George Eliot and others, there's religious faith is a much more self-consciously held thing. It's something that you always have to talk about and think about and work through your doubts about. Whereas for Jane Austen, there is no destabilization. She is just very sure of her faith, so much so that she doesn't need to talk about it. It's just there. So that's one thing I would say. It's before this epoch of modern doubt that I think in the 19th, the later 19th and 20th centuries, we came to take for granted. You never have a Graham Greene novel or others like that without a drama of doubt and faith. So it's not a Christian novel like that, but I think it's a novel that takes Christian foundation, or her novels are books that take certain kind of Christian faith for granted and presume upon them. Everyone around her said her faith was very deep. When she died, her brother, who wrote about her, and her nephew, who wrote another text about her, they all talked about her deep faith. But also her subtlety and modesty about it. She didn't let's say she wasn't heavy-handed about it. And she really didn't feel attacked in her faith, and so she was just not very self-conscious about it, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yes, it's more or less the air she breathes.
Yes, I think that's really true. I will say one last thing. we can make various objections to the kind of faith that she had, which had its limitations. Cardinal Newman, when he looked back at her, the faith of her, her novels, found it, somewhat frigid, and he has sort of a funny remark somewhere about the Jane Austen clergyman who was just cold and stiff.
Yes.
He said something like no glimpse of the grandness of Catholicism. I think he said this actually while still an Anglican, because he had very self-consciously made an older, more Catholic vision his own, under the strain and stress of that mid-century where everything was up in the air, and you really had to find it more for yourself and make it your own. Anyway, so later 19th century, more romantic writers would look back and say, that's not enough, but it's there, I would say, and there's something very rich there.
I just put it up because perhaps it's an aspect of her novels that we can sometimes overlook. And more recently she's presented sort of as a type of Georgian Regency writer of rom-coms, but there's more to her than that.
Yes, that's right. And this is one of the peculiarities of Austen, is that you can really spend a lot of time with her and not think about religion, because it's so much under the surface. And that this has been an advantage and a disadvantage to her. I think it's made it it's really widened her readership and her viewership, in the age of all of these adaptations and miniseries and everything. But then it's also facilitated misunderstandings. So I don't know. I tend to think it's an advantage in general because, frankly, because so many novels that wear religion on their sleeve end up being heavy-handed, and it's actually very challenging to do well. So I just tend to say, let's take her as she is, and we can look at religious questions and frameworks and foundations as they are helpful and useful. But then let's not expect her to be a 20th century novelist or a romantic or certainly not a Catholic novelist exactly. Although in many ways she's sort of more comfortable with certain kinds of Catholic ideas than many other novelists of her time. And for example, the Anglicanism of the 18th century and that she was familiar with was very comfortable with hierarchy. It was just utterly presumed. Hierarchy within the church and within the community. And is something hierarchy there, and then also a kind of basic liturgicals. I don't. We got to be careful with sacramental language. She wouldn't have had this exactly the same understanding of sacraments that a Catholic does, but there's still a presumption of liturgical order and broadly a sacramental understanding of the church and so forth.
So let's go to the first of the 5 books you've shortlisted, Pride and Prejudice. This is obviously her most famous novel. Why have you put this on top of your list? I mean, I suppose it's precisely because it is her
yes,
her most famous novel.
It's an easy choice. I think it is the greatest Austen novel. There are those who would dispute it, but I think it's an easy argument to make. It is the most popular and best known. I think the cinematic renditions of Pride and Prejudice are also some of the best. I think also it's maybe the funniest of her novels, which is another thing that attracted me to Austen as a young man, and which I still enjoy and love. This is part of what's fun about teaching her. So I think that's why I put it first. Yeah.
Is there anything about the novel you would like to stress?
Sure. So I'd like to say a few things about the way that Pride and Prejudice works, and some of this will really play out into her other novels. But the thing that I think sticks out most in Pride and Prejudice to me, and which really illuminates Jane Austen's contribution in general, is the centrality of what I would call character reading. Right there at the start of Pride and Prejudice, you have these two relatively young adults coming into contact with one another, Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, and she's trying to read his character. He even notices this at one point and asks her, "Are you a studier of characters?" She says, "Well, yes, I try to be." And this is a characteristic practice of the time, where you're trying to judge the kind of person you're dealing with. And in Pride and Prejudice, you're trying to say you're trying to get a sense of who are you, the person that I'm dealing with, and what is the story that you inhabit. So it's a very literary way of thinking about everyday moral life that is being dramatized here. Lizzie Bennet is basically writing a novel inside of the novel Pride and Prejudice. And then the drama comes from her misunderstandings, her misjudgments of the people around her. She essentially imagines the wrong story for herself and for Darcy and for this other young man, Mr. Wickham, and who is an army officer at the beginning of the novel. And it's through those misjudgments that she is moved forward towards a sort of climax of the book, where her narrative, which is her narrative, which is problematic, collides with reality and falls apart. And when that happens, she realizes that she herself is the reason she is misunderstood, that her misunderstandings have to do with her own moral weaknesses as a person. So part of what's so interesting about what I like about Pride and Prejudice, what's so interesting about it, is it has this really clear depiction of the way that we try to understand the world by judging the character of others, narrating the world that we live in, and then trying that narrative, and then we have to deal with the challenges to that narrative, which inevitably occur when it collides with real life. And what I'm trying to get to is that I think she has a great deal of insight into the way that our own personal moral life plays into that. Essentially, what she sees, Jane Austen, is that if I have problems in my own character, if I have pride, for example, or vanity, or other vices, envy, and so forth, those things will occlude my vision. They'll block me from seeing certain kinds of things, and they'll cause misunderstandings and misjudgments. And I can end up living in I can end up creating the wrong kind of story for my life and misunderstanding my relationship to other people and misunderstanding the truth because of problems in my own heart and my own character. And so when Elizabeth Bennet experiences this kind of narrative collapse, it causes her to reform her sense of everything, including herself. She says famously, "Till this moment, I never knew myself." When her story collapses around her and she realizes this. So this is one of those things that I think Alistair MacIntyre actually really appreciates about her, and it's very Aristotelian, that your character determines the kind of life you live, and that prudence, the virtue of practical reasoning, works in the world by judging the character of others, and that's how we make decisions all the time in life. This is something that's very, very alive in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and which MacIntyre thinks of in a kind of narrative way in After Virtue, that we tend to make judgments about others and their character by putting them into stories that we then try out against reality as we experience it. That's something that very alive in MacIntyre. It's a certain kind of narrative Aristotelianism, but I think that he learned a lot of that from Jane Austen, who dramatizes it over and over again in her novels, perhaps most clearly in Pride and Prejudice. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. And you mentioned that you liked some of the adaptations of Pride and Prejudice for the small screen or the big screen. What's your favorite one?
Oh, I mean, easily the one from, you'll have to check the dates, but I think it's the early 2000s. And I'm pretty sure it aired on BBC first, with Colin Firth, that one.
Okay.
It is, I think, easily superior. I don't really think much of the one from the later, the later 20-aughts, with the shorter one with Keira Knightley. I don't really care much for that one, but the one with the earlier one, it might have even been the 90s.
I think it was the earlier mid-90s.
Okay, yeah, that's the one that's the classic. There are earlier ones than that have actually more of Jane Austen's dialogue in them, but they're a little bit, I don't know, a little bit stale, perhaps. So that's the one that I think is the best.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview, or to support this podcast, visit the website 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast on the platform of your choice so that more people can discover it, and give it a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Until next time, God bless.